Akev, Moshe Rabbeinu recounts the tragic episode of Chet HaEgel, and more than Chet HaEgel, he really focuses on the aftermath of Chet HaEgel, and that is Shviras Luchos. And it's the time that again the Mefarshim are troubled with exactly where Moshe Rabbeinu saw that he had the right, or why in fact did Moshe Rabbeinu break the Luchos. Sometimes we erroneously assume it was almost a reaction that Moshe Rabbeinu had, but of course that's not the case. Moshe Rabbeinu was in complete control of himself. It's almost as if the Torah specifically wants to point out, don't think Moshe Rabbeinu Chalila lost control. The Torah says, "Ve'es bois b'shnei luchos." I held onto them, I grabbed them, "Ve'ashlichem al sheyada," and I threw them down. Moshe Rabbeinu says, this was not an error. This was not a rash decision. Chalila v'chas. This was something I did very deliberately, very intentionally. And the question is why? If Moshe Rabbeinu is going to spend so much time pleading on Klal Yisrael's behalf that they deserve another chance, so why smash the luchos? Save them. Hopefully they'll be used yet again. So we know that Chazal make a allusion, a mashal, to a husband and wife, and how sometimes we would try to destroy the evidence, if you will. If a wife is not faithful to her husband, try to destroy the evidence that there was a marriage that happened, and therefore you can't prove that there is any lack of morality. Perhaps that's what was going on over here, but of course we have to understand that on a deeper level. Rabbi Shalom doesn't need any proofs to anything. Destroying the shtar is not going to do anything in reality. If the Rabbi Shalom, of course, knows what it took place. So we have to understand exactly why it is that Moshe Rabbeinu threw down the Luchos, what exactly he was trying to accomplish by throwing down the Luchos. We once suggested fascinating insight based on the Chidah. Perhaps based on this insight we could understand. The Chidah writes, based on the Gemara in Mesechah Shabbos. The Gemara of Shabbos, we all know, the Gemara tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu, when he was Olol Amarim, when he goes to be Mekabel the Torah, the Malachei Ashares have a difficult time with parting with the Torah, and they say, why are you giving the Torah to a Basar V'Dam? Enoish Kisis Kerena. Why is a Basar V'Dam getting the Torah? And we know the aftermath of exactly what happens. Moshe Rabbeinu's response, he holds on to the Kisei HaKavod. But says the Chidah, fascinating insight. The Chidah says, what was the argument over here? The Malachei Asharis weren't coming without a proper taina. They know, of course, Baba Mitzia, Baba Kama, Baba Mitzia, Baba Vasa. They know the arguments. They were coming with legitimate taina, Liba de Hilchasa. And the Malachei Asharis were saying, don't you know that there's a din of Bar Metzra, Rabbi Shalom? How could you go against the din of Bar Metzra? If you're going to give a matana of the Torah to someone, you have to give it to us first. It's been in Shemayim. We are here in Shemayim. We inhabit Shemayim. What do the human beings, what does Klal Yisrael have the right to come and take the Torah before us? Don't you know the halacha of Dina Debar Metzra? So what's the response to the Malachei Asharis? Says the Chidah, the response could be found in the Shita Mikubetzes in Bava Mitzia and Daf Kuches, where the Shita Mikubetzes has a very interesting shaila, and the Shita Paskins over there, that in fact the din of Bar Mitzvah does normally apply, but there are some exceptions. Right? If a person wants to sell or give a matana to his child, so then we wouldn't say, oh, Dina de Bar Metzah, you have to give it to your neighbor first. No, your child, Brok Hara de Avua, in Balasada, Reitza Limkar, I say, Livnoi, Ein Din Kedima le Bar Metzah. And that was the response of Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu was saying, you're right, there's a Dina de Bar Metzah, but we are the children of the Rabbeinu Shalom, so there's no halacha of Bar Metzah when it comes to the children. Explains the Chidah how beautifully, based on the pasuk in Parshas Re'eh. Now we understand the smichos hadvarim. The Torah tells us, Ki sishma b'kol Hashem elokecha l'shmor es kol mitzvosav asher anochi mitzavcha hayom la'asos hayosher b'einei Hashem elokecha. La'asos hayosher b'einecha. What does that mean? La'asos hayosher ve'asisa hayosher v'atoiv lifnim mishuris hadin. What do we learn out from ve'asisa hayosher v'atoiv? The Gemara tells us That's where we learn out the Dina de Bar Metzra. So says the Torah in Parshas Re'eh, Lasos HaYoshev HaToiv. There's a halacha of Dina de Bar Metzra, and therefore the Torah follows it up right away. Bonim atem la'Hashem Elokeichem. But you are the children of the Rebbeinu Shalom. So therefore, since you're the children, don't think that there's a problem with Bar Metzra of you being Mekabel the Torah. Bonim atem la'Hashem Elokeichem. So perhaps Moshe Rabbeinu, when breaking the Luchos, was concerned that maybe now the Malachei Hasharis are right. Perhaps, but when Kal Yisrael have strayed from the past and they have forsaken the Rabbeinu Shalom Kaviyachal, so maybe now we no longer enjoy the status of Banim Atem L'Hashem Elokeichem, and now the Malachei Hasharis are correct. This is a big concern. Now Dina de Bar Metzra kicks in, and now Moshe Rabbeinu, once again, if we now the Malachei Hasharis are correct, now we have to re-earn our status of Banim Atem L'Hashem if we're going L'Hashem Elokeichem, if we are going to have a claim to the Torah. But I think based on this Gemara, perhaps we could get a deeper insight into exactly why Moshe Rabbeinu did break the Luchos. But first we have to understand the essence of this Gemara. This Gemara is very perplexing. Now it's true the Chidah has a nice blitz, he has a nice take on the Gemara, Dina de Bar Metzra, but on a Pashup Pshat level, how are we supposed to understand the Gemara? The Malachei Hasharis come to the Rebbeinu Shalom and they say, what do you mean? The Torah should stay up here. Today, it should be here in the Shemayim. We're the ones who are going to be able to understand the Torah the best. We're the ones that should be given the Torah. Why are you giving it to human beings? And we know the Rebbeinu Shalom says, Moshe, answer them. They have a good claim. Moshe Rabbeinu holds on to the Kisei HaGavod and he goes through some mitzvahs. He goes through the mitzvahs Zachar Yom Shabbos. He goes through the mitzvahs of Lo Yelcha Elohim Achirim Ben Amim. Atem Shruyim Shaim Dem Avdois Goychavim. Do you serve Avodah Zarah? Do you need a Shabbos? Right? He goes through the mitzvahs of Kabed Es Avicha V'Esimecha. Malachei Hasharis. Are these things relevant to you? Of course not. And therefore Moshe Rabbeinu wins the argument. But one has to understand what exactly is the Shak of Etari over here. What Meikara my Kasavar Lebasoif my Kasavar. The Malachei Hasharis knew what the contents of the Torah were. So of course we know the Beis Halevi and others explained that they weren't claiming that the mitzvah should be applicable to them. They were claiming that the bailus over the Torah, don't give the Torah to Klal Yisrael, don't give them the right to darshan. Loi b'shamayim that shouldn't be. That's what they were arguing on. We'll take bailus over the Torah, we will maintain control over the Torah, and you give the mitzvahs to Klal Yisrael. If that's the case, so what's Moshe Rabbeinu's response by saying we have all the mitzvahs that are applicable to us? The Malachei Hasharis know that the mitzvahs are only applicable to human beings. That wasn't their claim to begin with. Their claim was, we want control over the Torah. What is the Shaka V'Tarya between the Malachei Hasharis and Moshe Rabbeinu? So I think perhaps we can understand, based on another interesting detail in this week's Parsha, which gets focused back in Sefer Shemayos, but here as well it's fascinating that Moshe Rabbeinu repeats this point. Moshe Rabbeinu says, I went up to the mountain, Ba'aloisi ha'hara lakachas luchos ha'avonim, Luchos habris asher karas Hashem imochem ve'eshev bahar arba'im yoyim ve'arba'im laila. I stood on the mountain. I sat on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. Lechem lo yachalti umayim lo shosisa. I didn't eat bread and I didn't drink water. What is the need for this detail over here? What's Moshe Rabbeinu trying to say? What's the significance even of this? Did Moshe Rabbeinu really live 40 days, 40 nights without drinking or eating? Well, Memanoshach, if he did, obviously it was L'mala Min HaTeva, and the Rebbeinu Shem did a nace. So what's the significance? Okay, the Rebbeinu Shem did a nace, that you don't have to. It's almost as if he's saying, I wasn't able to eat for 40 days. Yeah, the Rebbeinu Shem did a nace, you didn't have to eat for 40 days. What's Moshe Rabbeinu's point over here? By repeating, I sat on the, if he really fasted 40 days and 40 nights, so we know a person can't, the Gemara Nedarim says, a person can't do that naturally. Elamai, the Rebbeinu Shem gave him superhuman power. So the Rebbeinu Shem gave you superhuman power. What's the need to repeat this over here? What's Moshe Rabbeinu's point at all by repeating this? So I think what Moshe Rabbeinu is getting at is a very central idea in terms of the transition, the transformation that takes place between Luchos Rishonos and Luchos Shniyos. We know that the Luchos Rishonos The Torah tells us were written by the Rabbi Shalom. Michtav Eloikim. It was a godly inscription. The Torah uses a very interesting lashon. Choros al haluchos. They were engraved on the stone, on the luchos. Choros al luchos. Now Chazal learned something very interesting out of choros al luchos. Al tikrei choros ela chayris. Ein lecha ben chayrin ela Misha oisek b'Torah uvemitzvos. Somehow Chazal learned from this lashon of choros that the Torah uses this phrase as choros. The Chazal learned out. Choros sounds like chayris gavaldik. Ein lecha ben chayrin ela misha oisek b'Torah uvemitzvos. What does this mean? Choros, chayris, two separate words. What are Chazal trying to tell us? Obviously, what Chazal mean is as follows. Take a look at these luchos. These two luchos were luchos avonim. They were stone, a physical entity. How does a physical entity have the ability to rise above its physical limitations? Where do we see the stones rose above their physical limitations? The Gemara says, "Mem v'samach shebeluchos b'nei yomdim." How is it possible? Physical stone rising above its physical limitations? How is it possible? Says the Gemara, Choros ala luchos. That's the koyach of Torah. The Torah gives the ability for something to rise above the physical limitations. Physical limitations are for this world, but when something is able to access the next world, which is only accessible through the Torah Akdosha, so then he's accessing a world without the physical limitations. When you take Torah and you superimpose it onto a physical entity, namely the stones, these stones are elevated in a way that they're no longer bound by their physical limitations. Choros ala luchos teaches Klal Yisrael a much more important, not that they were engraved alone, but it teaches Klal Yisrael that when you put Torah onto a physical entity, the entity rises above its physical limitations. And that's what Chazal mean. Ein lecha ben chayrin ela misha oisek b'Torah u'b'mitzvos. You're going to tell me I'm a boss of Adam. I was created with physical limitations. I have taivas, I have other bodily needs, I have physical limitations. You see those avanim, that Evan had physical limitations as well. How is it able to rise above its physical limitations? How is it possible? Choros ala luchos. How is it possible? Mem v'samach shebeluchos b'nei yomdim. That's the koyach of Torah. If that's the case, ein lecha ben chayrin. You want to know who's free? Who could free themselves from the temptation? Who could free themselves from the desire? Who could free themselves from the physical limitations? A human being who's bound by physical limitations. How is a person able to free themselves from those physical limitations? Only through the Torah. And that was the chiddush of Choros al haluchos. Now what happened was, Moshe Rabbeinu comes up to Shemayim, and the Malachei Hasharei say, we're Malachim. The Torah, the essence, the mitzvahs are yours, Ein Achanami. But the essence of Torah, that's relevant to Malachei Hashareis. This is a divine document. This is spiritual, this is Seichel Elokos. What does a human being have to do with Sichli Elokos? This is for Malachei Hashareis. And Bar Shalom says, Moshe Rabbeinu, you answer. Moshe Rabbeinu responds, you're 100% correct, Malachei Hashareis. This divine document, the Torah HaKadosha, is for entities which rise above physical limitations, which are Malachei Hashareis. But you see that it gives the koyach to physical beings to rise above as well. Moshe Rabbeinu says, "Mayim lo yishasisi, lechem lo achalti, v'mayim lo yishasisi." What Moshe Rabbeinu was saying is, Malachei Hashareis, you're correct, but what you don't appreciate is that these mitzvahs in the Torah, Zocher Sem Shabbos Lekadshoy, Kabed Es Avicha V'Yasimecha, these mitzvahs, the Torah gives the ability for a human being to rise above his physical limitations. That's what Moshe Rabbeinu is saying. I sat on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights, lechem lo achalti umayim lo yishasisi, proving to the Malachei Hashareis that yes, human beings have physical limitations. And you might think that therefore they can't connect to the Torah, they can't understand the Torah. But the Torah is exactly the opposite. It could allow a human being with physical limitations to turn into a malach, to rise above the physical limitations. That I could sit on a mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, I don't need to eat, I don't need to drink like a malach, because that's the ability, that's what the Torah does. That was the response of Moshe Rabbeinu to the Malachei Hasharis. Now Moshe Rabbeinu comes down with the mountain. He wins this victorious speech over the Malachei Hasharis, saying that the Torah has the ability to elevate human beings above and beyond their physical limitations. Choros ala luchos ein lecha ben chayrin ela misha oisik b'Torah mitzvahs. And he sees that Klal Yisrael failed. Klal Yisrael serving the Chet HaEgel. Moshe Rabbeinu realizes at that moment we have to make an adjustment. What's the adjustment? Does it mean that the Torah doesn't have the ability now to override the physical limitations? The Torah no longer has the ability of Ein Lecha Ben Chayrin El Misha Oisik B'Torah Mitzvahs, no longer Choros Al Luchos? That can't be. Then why would the Mishnah quote it? If it's only relevant to the Luchos Rishonos, why is the Mishnah quoting it? Of course it's relevant to the Luchos Shniyos. The only transition, the only thing that changes between Luchos Rishonos and Luchos Shniyos is that Luchos Rishonos were written by the Rabbeinu Shalom. That means until the Luchos Rishonos to Luchos Shniyos, the Torah was superimposed, was given to Klal Yisrael. A matana chinam, a matnas chinam. Moshe Rabbeinu says, unless Klal Yisrael comes and is psal lecha, they go through the arduous process of engraving the Torah themselves, psal lecha. Choros al libecha. Unless they go through that process and having to not be given it gratis from the Rabbeinu Shalom, not a michtav elikim, but they engrave it on themselves. They go through the hard work, as we've often quoted from the Beis HaLevi, the concept of a melis b'Torah, of a ein divrei Torah miskaymin el b'mishememis. That was all a product of Chet HaEgel, because that's what changed. At the moment Moshe Rabbeinu saw Chet HaEgel, he says, this madrega of choros ala luchos, this madrega of a human being be able to elevate himself via the Torah above his physical limitations. The madrega of ein lecha chayrin ela misha oisik b'Torah is of course going to be accomplished al yedei Torah, but it's going to have to be psal lecha. It's going to have to be Klal Yisrael is going to have to roll up their sleeves. And it can't be given it as a gift, because that doesn't work. We see with the Chet HaEgel. It can't be michtav elikim. It has to be Klal Yisrael rolling up their sleeves and psal lecha, writing it on luchos libecha, writing it on themselves, their heart. And then, yes, then it's going to be Ein Lecha Ben Chayrin El Misha Oisik B'Torah Mitzvahs. Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't lose himself, Chalil v'chas, and break the Luchos. Moshe Rabbeinu at that moment, I just won the war, the battle with the Malachim, and I proved to them that a human being can elevate himself beyond the physical limitations, Choros HaLuchos, and that's why I earned these Luchos. But I see that if it's the Rabbeinu Shalom writing, if it's the Rabbeinu Shalom giving it to us without us working hard for it, so we can't elevate ourselves. It has to be psal lecha. So he takes these luchos ve'esbois, as haluchos, he takes the luchos ve'ashlichem, and he breaks them, knowing that the luchos of michtav elikim is not going to be lasting. The luchos have to be psal lecha. Through a process of psal lecha, through a process of eina divrei Torah miskaymin el b'misha meimis atzmo, through a process of mesiras nefesh and amelas, through that process, the Torah elevates a person beyond his physical limitations and capabilities. Then we have a Zocher Shem Shabbos Lakadshoy. We have a mitzvah of Kabir Es Avicha, which we could respond to Malachei. Yes, you might be Malachei Hasharis now, but this Torah is going to make us into Malachei Hasharis. It's going to turn us into people that are elevated beyond our physical limitations, beyond our physical desires, beyond all of that drags us down. The Torah Akdosha is able to free us from those. Ein lecha ben chayir el misha oisik b'Torah mitzvah. And just like two stones could be freed from their physical limitations, Amen b'samel shebeluchos. If it's psal lecha, if we take the Torah and we write it psal lecha, we write it al luchos libecha, we too will be free from our physical limitations.